So this is based on work that Cathy and I carried out a number of years ago. Now it's quite scary how the years have gone by. And what we're hoping to do at this session, we had quite a bit of discussion about it, is share with you the findings of where we got to. We'd like to frame it a little bit more in current thinking, and we'd also like to use it to relaunch something, which is quite exciting. So it's been a really lovely opportunity actually for us to revisit some of our earlier ideas and talk about what was going on. So I was going to start with a little activity just on the next slide, which some of you might recognise, because peer observation is obviously so much part of what we ask our colleagues to do and kind of integral to our own practice, that I wanted to just ask you in the room to look at this picture. Now it's a Salvador Dali picture, and I just want you to think about what it is that you see in this picture. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to share this necessarily. So I'm going to ask you what you see and how you relate to what jumps out at you, what's familiar to you, and whether you're relating it to work that you already know, perhaps by Dali, or other work in art that you are interested in. So I'm going to give you a minute and I'm going to stop talking. I'm just going to ask you to look at this picture. And then if we could move on to the next slide, there's a very different image. Et à ce moment-là, je voulais commencer à vous parler en français. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous me comprenez. Ceci n'est pas une pipe, donc c'est une image de Magritte. Mais je vais vous demander de regarder l'image et de réfléchir de la même manière. So what is it that you see in this image as well? Thinking about what's familiar, what's not familiar. And I'm going to give you a minute again. Now, I don't know if that's a minute, but I'm going to stop there. And I thought I would just quite like to pause, and I think you can see what I was trying to do there, which was to find the familiar in what's in front of you, and also to see how it feels to perhaps be with something a bit less familiar and a bit less expected. And I think that's certainly very much where Cathy and I were coming from when we were talking about peer observation, but I'd quite like you just to keep that feeling with you as we go through the workshop and hopefully get a chance to talk about it later on. So it's finding the familiar, it's seeing things differently and being able to put that into dialogue with something else that's important. Hopefully now we're going to have a little voice from Cathy and I, so a video of Cathy and I discussing this presentation a few weeks ago. Hi, Cathy. It's great to have you on the other side of the screen today. We're together virtually at least, and that's the way you're joining us at this SEDA winter event. So we're going to talk today about our shed peer observation scheme that we started way back in 2017, and I remember discussions in 2016. And I wonder just if we could start by talking about how we came up with the idea, how it started and why we wanted to do this.
Yeah, great to be with you, Catriona, and to think back about the start of this whole scheme. And I think we were motivated by, trying to offer support for academic development colleagues who don't often prioritise their own CPD. And I remember thinking that peer observation of teaching is a great way to support one another in the practice that, the real range of practice that we do as educational developers, and that this had real potential, and that we were often saying this is something that is one of the most valuable parts of the PG cert that we run, and yet we weren't doing it ourselves. So I think those are some of my early recollections of why.
Yes,
how about you?
I do remember we talked a lot about modelling that practice, but also we talked a bit about the kind of shed community, so the Scottish Higher Educational Developers community, and the way that we sought to collaborate and work together, and that this was in a way an extension of this. But once we rolled out the scheme, and we can share details of that in the SEDA blog post that we wrote a couple of years ago, but what lessons do you think, or what were the challenges that we faced? Because there were many at that time.
Absolutely. I think we thought that, you know, by extending a peer observation scheme to other institutions, that offered such an amazing insight into different people's practice. And yet that in some ways was one of the real challenges, which was we've all got busy diaries, and trying to get people to be able to schedule just one date in the year when, you know, or two dates if you wanted to do the kind of, I'm going to come observe you, you'll come observe me. I remember we were trying to make it as easy as possible by including things like you could look at online teaching, you could look at all aspects of your practice, or even just a plan for something you're going to do and just talk through that with somebody. Even with all of that, I think colleagues just said it was so hard to schedule time. Time was just the enemy almost. It was like all of us were so pressed and pressured. So that was, I think, one of the key things. And also, I don't think we realised when we got some feedback from colleagues how many colleagues were either in precarious conditions within their jobs. So they were threatened with maybe not having a job in 6 months' time or a year's time, or they were brand new and they were saying, I don't really know anyone. And even though we'd tried to sort of say, come to us if you want suggestions and we can pair you up with someone, there were lots of those sort of logistical things that were quite challenging. Do you remember any of the other sort of barriers that we had?
I do remember some interesting comments in the feedback, and that was around perhaps a fear, the same things we hear everywhere, the fear of being vulnerable, of exposing yourself, particularly if you are new to being an educational developer, and given that kind of central role you play in an institution, making yourself vulnerable is a tricky one. But I think you're right. I think a lot of it was about the logistics, and that's kind of what we saw. So now when we fast forward 4 years, and a lot has changed, we've had a year or two of industrial action, a year or two of COVID. And actually, in some ways, we were just saying there's possibilities now that maybe were harder a few years ago. So we're seeing exciting things for the future, aren't we?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'm a cup half full person, and I definitely think I've been so inspired by colleagues' ability to adapt and change over the last 18 months. It wouldn't have been how people would have chosen to do a range of things, I'm sure. And certainly the emergency pivot to online teaching, I think, was really stressful for so many people, just the pressure of that. But there's a lot about online teaching that's been really positive, and there's been a lot about people's learning that's been positive. And so I think, you know, we've had a really difficult period of time where this scheme hasn't really been active. And I think, you know, it'd be great for us to be able to reinvigorate this with suggestions of, you know, let's do this on Teams. You don't actually have to travel between campuses. It's lovely to go and see other people's campuses. But I think it might make it easier for a lot of colleagues, actually, if we can say that, do it on Teams or Zoom. And again, a reiteration that we're reviewing the whole range of people's practice, so it doesn't have to be an active teaching session, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that sense of professional dialogue that we see in the literature, and that certainly we saw a lot of colleagues engage with in the pandemic and in the online teaching, it has opened up possibilities. So you're hearing it here first. It's a relaunch of the Shed Peer Observation Scheme. I'm going to sadly say goodbye to you now, Cathy, but I know you'll be with us in spirit. And thank you for taking part in this video.
Thanks, Catriona, and have a good conversation, everybody that's there. And I'm sorry I'm not with you.
Thanks, bye. So funny to hear Cathy, and of course we were talking about industrial action that had such an impact on our first set of peer observations, and that we're now today in a similar situation. So, as you could probably sense, it was a scheme that in one sense didn't go as we had hoped it had gone, and it would go, and didn't have the kind of big appeal, or wasn't engaged with as much as we would have liked. But actually, and as the next slide reveals, I think what it told us was how hard it is as educational developers to really prioritise our CPD. And it also really highlighted how much change we're undergoing and how much we're going through. And I think often our role as educational developers, and we heard this morning, both in the keynote, but also in the session I went to earlier, Amalia's session on empathy, and how much we kind of absorb a lot of the feelings of others in our roles, and what that can then lead to for us too. So I was going to pause there actually, and just moving on to the next slide, I'd be really curious to get a sense of your experiences of peer observation of teaching as educational developers. I'm really interested to have this conversation with you as part of SEDA, because obviously you have the SEDA triads and that kind of professional dialogue.